Thomas Mitchell had weathered 43 winters on the Broken Arrow Ranch, and each one had carved deeper lines into his face, like the wind carved canyons into stone. His hands, rough as tree bark, knew every fence post, every gate latch, every creek bed on his 1,000 acres of Montana grassland. But they had never known the gentle touch of a woman who loved him. The ranch had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Mitchell men had worked this land, raised cattle, and died alone. Thomas never questioned whether he would follow the same path. Love seemed like a luxury meant for other people, like those fancy folks in town who had time for such things. He had cattle to tend, hay to cut, and machinery that broke down faster than he could fix it. At 63, Thomas had accepted his solitude as naturally as he accepted the changing seasons. His days began before dawn with coffee black as crude oil and ended after sunset with a simple dinner eaten in silence. The only sounds in his small ranch house were the tick of his father's old clock and the settling of wood that had stood for nearly a century. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and Thomas preferred it that way. People in the small town of Cedar Falls knew him as the quiet rancher who paid his bills on time and never caused trouble. He bought supplies on Thursdays, nodded politely to familiar faces, and drove home to his empty house without lingering for conversation. His only companions were his cattle, an aging border collie named Rex, and the wild creatures that shared his land. Thomas found peace in this simple existence. He never felt lonely watching a sunset paint the sky orange and pink above his pastures. The sound of wind through tall grass was music enough for him. But on this particular October evening, nature had different plans for Thomas Mitchell. The storm rolled in from the northwest like an angry beast, turning the sky the color of old bruises. Thomas had been checking his cattle in the far pasture when the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time he reached the barn, lightning was splitting the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder shook the ground beneath his boots. Rex whined and pressed close to Thomas's legs as they stood in the barn doorway, watching sheets of rain sweep across the ranch. The wind howled through the gaps in the old wooden walls, making the whole structure creak and groan. Thomas had weathered plenty of storms, but this one felt different, meaner. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Just wind and water. Nothing we haven't seen before." But even as he spoke, Thomas felt uneasy. The horses in the nearby stalls stamped nervously, and the cattle had crowded together near the feed shelter, their eyes wide with fear. Animals always knew when something bad was coming. The lights in the barn flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Thomas fumbled for the flashlight he kept on a nail by the door, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if the sky itself was angry at the world below. That's when he heard it. Between the crashes of thunder and the drumming of rain on the metal roof, there came a different sound. A car engine, sputtering and struggling against the storm. Then silence. Thomas stepped to the window and wiped away the condensation with his sleeve. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could barely make out headlights flickering weakly about a quarter mile down his dirt road. As he watched, even those lights went dark. "Somebody's in trouble," he said to Rex, who whined in response. Thomas grabbed an old raincoat from a hook and pulled it on, though he knew it wouldn't keep him dry in this weather. He found a stronger flashlight in his toolbox and checked that his cell phone was in his pocket, though service was always spotty out here even in good weather. "Stay here," he told Rex, then stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like ice-cold bullets, soaking through his coat in seconds. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, and he had to lean forward and fight for every step toward the road. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark black and white snapshots, and in one of those brief moments of clarity, Thomas saw her. A small blue car sat tilted in the ditch beside his road, steam rising from under its crumpled hood. A figure stood beside the driver's door, barely visible through the rain. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the person was soaked to the skin and struggling against the wind. He picked up his pace, slipping and sliding on the muddy ground. As he got closer, his flashlight beam revealed a woman in her 40s, her dark hair plastered to her head, wearing what had once been a nice business suit but was now a soggy mess. She was trying to open the car door, but it seemed to be jammed. "Ma'am!" Thomas called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Are you hurt?" The woman spun toward his voice, shielding her eyes against his flashlight beam. Even in the harsh light and driving rain, Thomas could see she was frightened, but trying to stay calm. "My car just died," she shouted back. "I was trying to reach Cedar Falls, but I must have taken a wrong turn. I didn't see your driveway in time to stop before sliding into this ditch." Lightning crashed again, so close that Thomas felt the electricity in the air. The woman flinched and moved closer to him. "We need to get inside," Thomas yelled. "This storm is getting worse." He tried to help her with the car door, but the frame was bent from sliding into the ditch. Through the window, he could see her purse and a small suitcase on the passenger seat. "Leave it for now," he said. "We'll come back when the storm passes." The woman hesitated for a moment, looking back at her car with obvious concern. But another crack of thunder made up her mind for her. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Thomas offered her his arm, and together they fought their way back toward the barn. The wind seemed determined to push them off course, and twice the woman stumbled, only Thomas's steady grip keeping her upright. By the time they reached the barn door, both of them were breathing hard and completely drenched. Inside, the barn felt like a sanctuary after the violence of the storm outside. Thomas led the woman to a pile of clean hay bales where she could sit down. Rex approached cautiously, tail wagging slightly, sensing that this stranger needed kindness. In the weak light of Thomas's flashlight, he got his first good look at his unexpected guest. She was probably in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a face that might have been pretty if it weren't pale with cold and stress. Her business suit suggested she wasn't from around here, and the way she sat with careful posture told him she wasn't used to barns and hay bales. "I'm Thomas Mitchell," he said, finding an old horse blanket and offering it to her. "This is my ranch." "Maria Santos," she replied gratefully, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I was driving from Billings to Cedar Falls for a job interview tomorrow, but I think I got lost when the storm hit." Thomas nodded. "Easy to do on these back roads, especially in weather like this. Cedar Falls is still about 20 miles from here." Maria's face fell. 20 miles? "But my interview is at 9 in the morning. "Well, you're not going anywhere tonight," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "That storm isn't letting up anytime soon, and your car's going to need a tow truck to get out of that ditch." As if to emphasize his point, thunder crashed overhead, and the rain drummed even harder on the roof. Maria looked around the barn, taking in the horse stalls, the hay bales, and the old farming equipment. "Would it be all right if I stayed here tonight? In the barn, I mean. I don't want to impose on you any more than I already have." Thomas studied her face in the flashlight beam. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the worry in her eyes. No woman should have to spend the night in a cold barn during a storm like this. "Nonsense," he said. "You'll catch pneumonia out here. My house isn't much, but it's warm and dry. You can stay there tonight and we'll figure out your car situation in the morning." "I couldn't," Maria protested. "I'm a complete stranger. You don't know anything about me." "I know you're cold and wet and probably hungry," Thomas replied. "And I know you're stuck on my land in the middle of a storm. That's enough." For a moment, Maria just stared at him. In her world of city life and corporate meetings, strangers didn't usually offer help so freely. but something in Thomas's weathered face told her she could trust this quiet rancher. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind of you." Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in decades. It might have been the way she said thank you, or the brave way she was handling a difficult situation, or simply the fact that another human being was sharing this space with him. Whatever it was, it made the barn feel different somehow, less empty. "We'll wait here until the worst of this passes," he said. "Then we'll make a run for the house." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Rex had settled himself near Maria's feet, apparently deciding she was acceptable. The horses in their stalls had calmed down now that humans were present, and the familiar sounds of the barn at night began to emerge beneath the noise of the storm. Thomas found himself stealing glances at this unexpected visitor. It had been so long since he'd had anyone to talk to that he'd almost forgotten how. But Maria didn't seem to expect conversation. She was content to sit quietly, occasionally reaching down to pet Rex, who was clearly enjoying the attention. When the rain finally eased from a downpour to a steady shower, Thomas stood up. "Ready to make a run for it?" Maria nodded, still clutching the horse blanket around her shoulders. "Ready?" They stepped back out into the night, and Thomas led her across the muddy yard to his small ranch house. The porch light was out, but he found his keys and opened the door, ushering her inside. The house was simple but clean, with worn furniture that had seen better days and walls decorated with old photographs of the ranch through the years. Thomas turned on a few lamps, filling the space with warm yellow light that made it feel cozy despite its plainness. "I'll get the fire going," Thomas said, kneeling by the stone fireplace. "And I think I have some coffee. If you'd like some." "Coffee sounds wonderful," Maria said, still taking in her surroundings. This was clearly a bachelor's home, but it was neat and comfortable. She could see the care that had gone into maintaining everything, even if it was all decades old. As Thomas built up the fire, Maria noticed the photographs on the mantel. Pictures of cattle, of the ranch in different seasons, and of what must have been his father and grandfather standing in front of the same house. All the photos showed men alone or with animals. No women, no children, no family gatherings. The fire caught and began to crackle, filling the room with warmth. Thomas stood up and brushed off his hands. "I'll put some coffee on," he said. "And I think I have some soup in the kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it's warm." As he disappeared into the kitchen, Maria settled into an old armchair near the fire, finally beginning to feel warm and safe. Outside, the storm continued, but it seemed far away now. She thought about her job interview in the morning, about her car stuck in the ditch, about how her carefully planned life had suddenly taken this unexpected turn. But mostly, she found herself thinking about the quiet man who had appeared in the storm like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was saying. The coffee was stronger than anything Maria had tasted in years, and the simple chicken soup from a can seemed like the best meal she'd ever eaten. She sat across from Thomas at his small kitchen table, both of them finally warm and dry, the storm now just background noise against the windows. Thomas had changed into clean clothes and offered Maria an old flannel shirt and some sweatpants that had belonged to his father. They were too big for her, but they were warm and dry, which was all that mattered. Her business clothes hung over chairs near the fire, steaming slightly. "So you were going to Cedar Falls for a job interview?" Thomas asked, refilling her coffee cup. It was the first real conversation they'd attempted, and he felt rusty at it. "Yes, at the elementary school. I'm a teacher." Maria wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Or I was a teacher. I lost my job in Denver when they had budget cuts last spring. I've been looking for work ever since." "That's tough," Thomas said. "Schools shouldn't be cutting teachers." "Tell me about it." Maria managed a small smile. "What kind of work do you do here?" Besides ranching, I mean. Just ranching, Thomas replied. Cattle mostly, some horses, grow hay for feed. It's not exciting work, but it's steady. Maria looked around the kitchen, noting the old appliances that were clean but ancient, the worn linoleum floor, the simple wooden cabinets. How long have you lived here? All my life. This was my father's place and his father's before that. I guess I never saw any reason to leave. There was something in his voice that made Maria curious. Never wanted to see what else was out there? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I thought about it when I was young, but my dad got sick when I was 23, and somebody had to run the ranch. By the time he passed, I was already set in my ways, I guess. That was 40 years ago? About that. Yeah. Thomas looked up at her. What about you? Always been a teacher? For the last 15 years. Before that, I was married and stayed home with my daughter. Maria's voice grew softer. My husband died in a car accident when Emma was 12. I went back to school and got my teaching degree so I could support us. I'm sorry, Thomas said simply. That must have been hard. It was. But Emma's grown up now, living her own life in California. And I discovered I love teaching. Kids that age, they're still curious about everything, still believe anything is possible. They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, though rain still pattered against the windows. The fire in the living room crackled softly, and somewhere in the house, the old clock continued its steady ticking. Can I ask you something? Maria said after a while. Thomas nodded. When you came out in that storm to help me, you didn't even hesitate. You could have just stayed in your warm barn and waited for morning. Why did you help a complete stranger? Thomas considered the question carefully. I guess because it was the right thing to do, and because I know what it feels like to be alone. The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep in Maria's chest. She studied his face in the soft kitchen light, seeing the kindness in his eyes that matched his actions. You live here all by yourself? Just me and Rex, Thomas said, and the animals, of course. But yeah, just me in the house. Doesn't it get lonely? Thomas was quiet for so long that Maria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I used to think it didn't. I had my routines, my work, my land. Seemed like enough. He paused. But sitting here tonight, talking with you, I'm remembering what I've been missing. Maria felt her heart skip a little at his words. There was something about this quiet, honest man that drew her in. Maybe it was his gentleness, or the way he'd helped her without expecting anything in return, or simply the fact that he seemed to see her as a person worth listening to. What about you? Thomas asked. Since your daughter's grown and you lost your job, what's been keeping you going? Hope, I guess, Maria said. Hope that there's still something good waiting for me. I know that sounds silly at my age. Doesn't sound silly at all, Thomas replied. Sometimes hope is all we've got. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories from their very different lives. Maria told him about teaching inner-city kids who faced challenges she could barely imagine, about watching them grow and learn despite everything working against them. Thomas spoke about the rhythm of ranch life, the satisfaction of watching calves grow strong, the peace of sunrise over endless grassland. Neither of them had talked this much to another person in months, maybe years. They discovered they both loved reading, though Thomas preferred westerns and history, while Maria favored mysteries and biographies. Both of them missed the old ways of doing things, when people took time to really know their neighbors. I should let you get some sleep, Maria finally said, noticing Thomas trying to hide a yawn. You've been more than kind already. The guest room is upstairs, Thomas said, standing up. It's not fancy, but the bed's comfortable. I put some extra blankets up there earlier." As they climbed the narrow staircase, Maria noticed more family photographs lining the walls. 3 generations of Mitchell men, all serious-faced and solitary. It struck her how lonely this house must have been for so many years. The guest room was small but clean, with a double bed covered in a handmade quilt and a window that looked out over the pastures. Thomas had indeed left extra blankets folded at the foot of the bed, along with a fresh towel. "If you need anything during the night, just holler," he said, lingering in the doorway. "And don't worry about tomorrow. We'll figure out your car situation after breakfast." "Thank you, Thomas, for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "I'm glad I did," he said softly, and Maria could see he meant it. After he left, Maria sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. The storm had passed, leaving a clear sky full of stars like she'd never seen in the city. The silence was profound, broken only by distant sounds of cattle settling for the night. She thought about her job interview in the morning, but it seemed less important now somehow. She thought about her empty apartment in Denver, about the loneliness that had been her constant companion since Emma left for college. And she thought about the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had given her shelter without asking for anything in return. Downstairs, Thomas was having similar thoughts as he banked the fire and turned off the lights. The house felt different tonight with another person in it. Less empty, more alive. He found himself listening for sounds from upstairs, comforted by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He thought about Maria's laugh when he'd told her about the time his horse had dumped him in the creek, about the way she'd listened when he talked about his father, about how natural it felt to share a meal and conversation with her. For 40 years, he'd convinced himself he didn't need human companionship. Tonight, he was beginning to understand what he'd been missing. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn as always, but instead of his usual solitary coffee and quick breakfast, he found himself planning a real meal. He had eggs from his own chickens, bacon in the freezer, and the makings for pancakes. When was the last time he'd cooked breakfast for someone else? He was careful to keep the noise down, not wanting to wake Maria too early. But as he started the coffee pot, he heard footsteps on the stairs. "Good morning," Maria said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. She'd put her business clothes back on, though they were wrinkled from their soaking the night before. Her hair was neatly brushed, and she looked like she was preparing to face the day's challenges. "Morning," Thomas replied, pleased to see her. "Coffee's almost ready. I was thinking about making some breakfast before we deal with your car." "You don't have to do that. You've done enough already." "I want to," Thomas said simply, and Maria could see he meant it. As they shared breakfast, the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows revealed the storm's damage. Tree branches scattered across the yard, muddy puddles everywhere, and Maria's car still tilted at an awkward angle in the ditch. "It looks pretty stuck," Maria said, peering out the window with obvious dismay. "I've got a tractor," Thomas said. "Might be able to pull it out, but we should have a look at the engine first. If it's flooded, you'll need a mechanic anyway." After breakfast, they walked out to examine the car. In daylight, the damage was more apparent. The front end was crumpled against a large rock, the hood was dented, and when Thomas tried to start it, nothing happened. "I'm afraid you're not driving this anywhere today," he said gently. Maria's face fell. "My interview is in 2 hours. I was really hoping for this job." Thomas thought for a moment. "Cedar Falls isn't that far. I could drive you to town in my truck if you don't mind riding in something that's seen better days." "You'd do that? But what about your work here?" "Cattle can wait a few hours," Thomas said. "Besides, I need to go to town anyway, to call about getting your car towed." Maria looked at this kind man who kept helping her without expecting anything in return and felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. "Then yes," she said, "I'd be very grateful for the ride." An hour later, they were bouncing down the dirt road in Thomas's old pickup truck, Maria clutching the door handle as they hit the worst potholes. Despite her nervousness about the interview, she found herself laughing at Thomas's stories about learning to drive on these same roads as a teenager. "My father said if I could handle this road in winter, I could drive anywhere," Thomas said, expertly steering around a particularly deep rut. He was probably right. "How long has it been since you've been to town?" Maria asked. "Few weeks, I guess. I don't get out much." As they approached Cedar Falls, Maria felt her stomach tighten with nerves. She'd been out of work for months, and this job meant everything to her future. But she also found herself reluctant to leave Thomas's truck, to return to the world of schedules and obligations and polite strangers. "The school's just up ahead," Thomas said, pointing to a cluster of brick buildings. "What time should I pick you up?" "You don't have to wait for me," Maria said. "I can find another way back to get my things." "I'll be here," Thomas said firmly, "however long it takes." Maria looked at him, this quiet man who'd appeared in her life like a guardian angel during the storm, and realized she didn't want to say goodbye to him. Not yet. "Thomas," she said softly, "thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need," he replied. "Just go in there and show them what a good teacher you are." As Maria walked toward the school building, Thomas watched her go with an unfamiliar ache in his chest. For the first time in 40 years, he was going to miss someone when they left his ranch. Thomas spent the morning in town taking care of business he'd been putting off for weeks. He arranged for Maria's car to be towed to Jimmy's garage, bought supplies at the hardware store, and even stopped by the diner for coffee and pie. But every few minutes he found himself checking the clock on the wall, wondering how Maria's interview was going. The school principal, Mrs. Henderson, had seemed impressed when Maria walked into her office. Despite her wrinkled clothes and the story of her car breaking down in the storm, Maria's credentials were solid, and she answered every question with the confidence that came from 15 years of loving what she did. "We need someone who can handle our fourth-grade class," Mrs. Henderson explained. "The previous teacher retired unexpectedly, and we're already 3 weeks into the school year. It's a challenging group this year. Lots of energy, and a few kids with difficult home situations." "Those are often the students who need us most," Maria replied. "Some of my best successes have been with kids who seemed impossible at first." The interview lasted an hour, and when Mrs. Henderson walked her to the door, Maria felt cautiously optimistic. "We'll be in touch by the end of the week," the principal said, shaking her hand warmly. Thomas was waiting in the parking lot when she emerged, leaning against his truck and chatting with a man Maria didn't recognize. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "How did it go?" he asked as she approached. "Better than I hoped," Maria said. "They'll let me know by Friday." "That's great news." Thomas turned to the other man. "Maria, this is Doc Peterson. He's been the veterinarian here for about 30 years. Doc Peterson was a friendly man with gray whiskers and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thomas tells me you're a teacher from Denver," he said, shaking her hand. "We could use more good teachers around here." "I hope I get the chance," Maria replied. "Well, if you do decide to stick around, you'll find Cedar Falls is a good place to make a fresh start," Doc said. "Folks here look out for each other." As they drove back toward the ranch, Maria found herself seeing the landscape differently. Yesterday, it had seemed like the middle of nowhere, all empty grassland and endless sky. Today, she noticed the way the afternoon light painted the hills golden, the peaceful way cattle grazed in distant pastures, the sense of space and freedom that stretched to the horizon. "It's beautiful out here," she said, surprising herself by meaning it. "I've always thought so," Thomas replied. though I suppose it's not everyone's cup of tea. Pretty quiet compared to city life. Sometimes quiet is exactly what a person needs. They stopped at Jimmy's garage to check on Maria's car. The news wasn't good. The engine had been flooded, the radiator was cracked, and the front axle was bent. Jimmy, a grease-stained man with a friendly manner, delivered the bad news gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this car's seen better days even before last night. To fix everything that's wrong, you're looking at more money than the car's worth. Might be better to call it a total loss." Maria felt her stomach drop. The car wasn't much, but it was her only transportation, and she didn't have money for another one. Her savings had dwindled during her months of unemployment. "I can tow it to the junkyard for you," Jimmy offered kindly. "Get you whatever salvage value there is." "That would be fine," Maria said quietly, trying to hide her dismay. Without a car, how could she even take the job if she got it? Thomas watched her face and saw the worry she was trying to conceal. "Let's head back to the ranch," he said. "We can figure out the details later." The drive back was quieter than the trip to town. Maria stared out the window, calculating in her head. Bus fare back to Denver. Money for a cheap used car if she could find one, rent on an apartment she couldn't really afford while she looked for another job. The numbers didn't add up to anything hopeful. "You're worrying," Thomas observed. "A little," Maria admitted. "I'm trying to figure out what to do next." "Well, you're welcome to stay at the ranch until you do. No sense rushing into anything." Maria looked at him in surprise. "I couldn't impose on you like that. You barely know me." "I know enough," Thomas said simply. "I know you're a good person in a tough spot. I know you love teaching kids, and I know this old ranch has been too quiet for too long." That evening, they sat on Thomas's front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Rex lay at their feet, content to have both humans nearby. The air was crisp and clean after the storm, carrying the scent of wet earth and grass. "Can I tell you something?" Maria said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Sure. When I was driving here yesterday before the storm hit, I was thinking about giving up. Not just on the job search, but on everything. It felt like the world didn't have a place for me anymore." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now I'm sitting on a porch in Montana watching the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen, and for the first time in months, I feel like maybe there's still some good waiting for me." "There is," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "I'm sure of it." They talked late into the evening again, sharing more stories, more pieces of their lives. Maria told him about Emma's wedding plans, about the students she still missed from her old school, about her dreams of having a classroom of her own again. Thomas spoke about his hopes for the ranch, about the improvements he'd been wanting to make, about how nice it was to have someone to share his meals with. "Thomas," Maria said as they finally prepared to go inside, "can I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "In 40 years, was there never anyone? No one you cared about?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, gazing out at the star-filled sky. "There was a girl when I was young, Sarah Miller. We talked about getting married, starting a family, but when my dad got sick, she didn't want to wait around for a rancher who might never have time for her. She married a banker from Billings instead." "Did you love her?" "I thought I did then. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of not being alone. Sarah wanted things I couldn't give her. A big house in town, fancy clothes, vacations to places I'd never heard of. We weren't really suited for each other. Do you think you would have been happy if she'd stayed?" Thomas considered this. "No, I don't think so. And neither would she. Sometimes what we think we want isn't what we need." Maria felt there was something important in his words, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The next few days settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with how natural it felt. Thomas did his morning chores while Maria made breakfast. She helped him with small tasks around the ranch, learning to gather eggs from his chickens and feed the horses. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together and talked about everything and nothing. Maria discovered she loved the peace of ranch life, the way time moved differently when measured by seasons instead of clocks. Thomas found himself looking forward to sharing his daily discoveries with her, showing her the first wildflowers of fall, teaching her to read the sky for weather signs. On Thursday evening, the phone rang. Mrs. Henderson from the school. "Miss Santos, I'm pleased to offer you the position," the principal said. "If you're still interested, we'd like you to start Monday morning." Maria's heart raced. "Yes, absolutely. I'm very interested." "Wonderful. There are some forms to complete, and you'll need to arrange for housing in town. Most of our teachers live within a few miles of the school." After she hung up, Maria turned to find Thomas watching her with a mixture of happiness and sadness in his eyes. "Good news?" he asked. "I got the job," Maria said, but her voice lacked the excitement such news should have carried. "That's wonderful. You'll be great at it." They were both quiet, the unspoken question hanging between them. She had a job, but no car and no place to live. He had been happier these past few days than he'd been in decades, but she belonged in town with her teaching career. "I suppose I should look for an apartment tomorrow," Maria said finally. "Suppose so," Thomas agreed, though his voice was flat. Neither of them slept well that night. Maria lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, thinking about returning to a life of solitude after discovering how good it felt to share her days with someone who truly listened. Thomas sat by his bedroom window, looking out at the empty land and imagining how quiet the house would be again. The next morning, they drove to town in subdued silence. Maria looked at several small apartments, all depressingly similar with their worn carpets and thin walls. She filled out applications and left deposits, but each step felt like she was walking away from something precious. Thomas waited for her at each place, helping carry her paperwork, offering opinions when asked. But Maria could see the sadness in his eyes, and it matched her own. By afternoon, they'd found her a suitable place, a small apartment above the town's only bookstore. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a kind, elderly woman who promised to have it ready by Sunday. "It's perfect," Maria said, trying to sound enthusiastic. But perfect was Thomas's ranch, watching sunrise from his kitchen window, falling asleep to the sound of wind through grass. As they walked back to Thomas's truck, Maria suddenly stopped. "This is crazy," she said. "What is?" "This whole thing. Me moving to town, you going back to being alone, both of us pretending this week didn't change everything." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to live in that apartment. I don't want to be 20 miles away from you, only seeing you when you come to town for supplies. I'm saying this feels like the biggest mistake of my life." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Ranch life isn't easy. It's hard work and long days and sometimes weeks without seeing another soul except me." "I'm sure," Maria said. And she was. "If you'll have me." "If I'll have you?" Thomas laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Maria, these past few days have been the happiest of my life. I've been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay without sounding like a lonely old fool." "You're not old," Maria said, stepping closer to him. "And you're definitely not a fool. What about your teaching job? Cedar Falls isn't that far. I could drive it easily if I had a car. Or maybe there's another way." Thomas thought for a moment. "Doc Peterson mentioned he's been looking for someone to help with his practice. Filing, scheduling, basic office work. It's only part-time, but with some substitute teaching, you might be able to make it work." "From the ranch?" "From the ranch," Thomas confirmed. "If that's what you want." "It's what I want," Maria said without hesitation. That evening, They called Mrs. Henderson together to explain the situation. The principal was disappointed but understanding, especially when Maria offered to substitute teach whenever they needed her. "Teachers who really care are rare," Mrs. Henderson said. "If you change your mind about full-time work, give us a call." As they sat on the porch that night, watching another spectacular sunset, Maria felt a peace she hadn't known she was searching for. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, taking her hand for the first time. "None," Maria said, squeezing his fingers. "What about you? Sure you want a city woman cluttering up your quiet ranch?" "I've been waiting 40 years for the right person to clutter it up," Thomas said. "I just didn't know it until now." 6 months later, on a spring morning with wildflowers blooming in the pastures, Thomas Mitchell and Maria Santos were married by the Justice of the Peace in Cedar Falls. The only witnesses were Doc Peterson, Mrs. Chen from the bookstore, and Rex the border collie who wore a bow tie for the occasion. Their life together wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, but it was something better, real and solid and built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Maria found fulfillment in part-time work at the veterinary clinic and substitute teaching, while helping Thomas modernize some of the ranch operations. Thomas discovered that sharing his land with someone who loved it as much as he did made every sunrise more beautiful. The ranch house was no longer silent. It filled with Maria's laughter, the sound of classical music on the radio, and long conversations that stretched late into the evening. The walls that had witnessed 3 generations of solitary Mitchell men now echoed with the voices of 2 people who had found in each other what they hadn't even known they were missing. Sometimes on stormy nights, as they sat by the fire listening to wind and rain against the windows, Thomas and Maria would remember the night they met. They would think about the chances that had brought them together, about the timing that had to be exactly right for 2 lonely people to find each other in the middle of Montana grassland. And they would be grateful for storms, for broken-down cars, for wrong turns that led to exactly the right place. Love had finally come to the Broken Arrow Ranch, and it was better than either of them had dared to hope for all those years of waiting.